What if I told you that civilization didn't begin the way we've been taught? What if the oldest cities, the first written words, the earliest maps of the stars, all appeared in one place, at one time, fully formed? No trial and error, no slow evolution, just sudden, impossible brilliance. Tonight, we're going back to the beginning, or perhaps to the last echo of something far older. Before we step into the ancient world together, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and the time where you are. There's something beautiful about knowing this story is being heard across the world, at the same moment, in different corners of the night. And if this kind of journey speaks to you, go ahead and subscribe. You're in good company here. Here's what we're going to explore tonight. First, we'll uncover how an entire civilization appeared in the deserts of ancient Iraq with no ancestors, no rough drafts, no practice runs, just perfection from day one. Second, we'll examine a list of kings who ruled for thousands of years before a great flood swept the world clean. Not mythology, official records, written by the same hands that counted grain and taxed citizens. And third, we'll ask the question that archaeologists whisper but rarely print. Where did the Sumerians get their knowledge? And who were they remembering? By the end of this journey, you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about human history. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Picture this. The year is 1849. Southern Iraq. The air shimmers with heat that makes the horizon bend and waver like water. A group of British and French archaeologists stand in the desert, surrounded by mounds of earth that the locals call tells. These aren't natural hills. They're the compressed remains of ancient cities, layer upon layer of human civilization, pressed into the ground like pages in a book. The archaeologists don't know it yet, but they're about to open a time capsule that will rewrite everything we understand about human history. Their shovels strike something hard beneath the sand. Not stone. Clay. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, stacked like the fossilized memory of an entire people. The tablets are covered in strange wedge-shaped marks, pressed into the wet earth more than 5,000 years ago. When the inscriptions are finally decoded, the archaeologists realize they've discovered something impossible. These aren't the crude scratches of early humans learning to communicate. This is sophisticated writing, complex grammar, advanced mathematics, detailed astronomical charts. It's as if someone had buried a modern library in the Stone Age. The people who created these tablets called themselves the Sumerians. And from the moment their name was spoken aloud again after millennia of silence, something unsettling began to stir in our understanding of civilization. Because what they left behind wasn't the hesitant beginning of a newborn culture. It was already fully formed, already brilliant, already aware of the cosmos in ways that would take other civilizations thousands of years to achieve. The Sumerians appeared in history like a light switching on in a dark room. No warning. No gradual brightening. Just sudden, complete illumination. And then, just as mysteriously as they appeared, they vanished. But their clay tablets remained, waiting in the desert dust. Waiting for someone to ask the questions that make your skin prickle in the quiet hours before dawn. How did they know so much, so fast? Where did they come from? And what happened to the knowledge they possessed before the world forgot their name? Let's talk about location, because in real estate and in ancient civilizations, location is everything. The Sumerians settled in a place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia. The word means between the rivers. And those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were the lifeblood of everything that followed. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just a good spot to grow crops. This was the crossroads of the ancient world. To the west, the Mediterranean and eventually Europe. To the east, the vast expanse of Asia. To the south, the Arabian Peninsula and the sea routes to Africa. If you wanted to control trade between three continents, you couldn't pick a better location. And the Sumerians didn't just stumble into this position. They exploited it with a sophistication that suggests they understood exactly what they were doing. Every spring, the rivers would flood. But unlike the unpredictable Nile, these floods were seasonal and manageable. The water would retreat, leaving behind rich, dark silt, perfect for growing barley, wheat, and dates. The Sumerians didn't just farm this land. They engineered it. They built canals. Not simple ditches, but complex irrigation networks that could transport water miles from the river to fields in the desert. They constructed reservoirs and dikes. They created systems to control water flow during droughts and floods. This wasn't primitive agriculture. This was hydraulic engineering on a massive scale, and it required advanced mathematics, careful planning, and a level of organization that shouldn't exist in a culture that supposedly just figured out how to stop wandering and settle down. The rivers also served as highways. Long before roads connected the ancient world, the Tigris and Euphrates carried boats loaded with goods, ideas, and people. The Sumerians traded with distant lands, importing gold from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon. They didn't just survive in this landscape, they mastered it. They bent the rivers to their will and turned a desert into the garden of the ancient world. But here's the question that keeps nagging at the back of your mind. This kind of mastery takes generations to develop. Trial and error. Floods that destroy cities. Canals that fail. Crops that wither. Yet when the Sumerians appear in the archaeological record, they're already experts. Already building cities that will last for thousands of years. Already engineering irrigation systems that won't be surpassed until the Roman Empire. It's as if they arrived with the instruction manual already written. Here's where it gets really strange. Are you still with me? Good. Because this is the part that made archaeologists argue for decades. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, something extraordinary happened in southern Mesopotamia. And I mean extraordinary in the most literal sense. Outside the ordinary, beyond normal patterns of human development, cities appeared. Not villages that slowly grew into towns that eventually became cities. Actual cities. With populations in the tens of thousands, with monumental architecture, with complex governments and specialized labor forces. The city of Uruk, for example. At its peak, it covered 2.5 square miles. Its walls stretched for 6 miles. Inside those walls lived somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's larger than most European cities would be for another 3,000 years. But it's not just the size that's remarkable. It's what these cities contained. Writing systems, fully developed from the very start. The Sumerians used cuneiform, a script made of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. And here's the thing, writing systems usually evolve gradually. Simple pictures become abstract symbols, meaning develops in layers over centuries. Not with cuneiform. It appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated, already capable of expressing complex ideas, recording laws, documenting trade agreements, preserving poetry. Then there's the mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system. That's why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They understood geometry. They calculated area and volume. They used advanced multiplication and division. And the astronomy. Oh, the astronomy. This is where it gets really interesting. The Sumerians tracked the movements of Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telescope. They recorded the phases of the moon. They mapped the paths of Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn. They divided the sky into the 12 signs of the zodiac, a system we still use today. They knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. Not with the naked eye. Not without centuries of careful observation and record-keeping. But the records show no centuries of development. No gradual accumulation of knowledge. It's all just there, from the beginning, like someone opened a textbook and started on chapter 10. Imagine if archaeologists 3,000 years from now dug up the ruins of Silicon Valley, and they found iPhones, laptops, fiber optic cables. But when they looked for the earlier technology, the telephone lines, the telegraph machines, the printing presses, there was nothing, just desert. And then, suddenly, all at once, the internet age. That's what the Sumerian archaeological record looks like. A civilization that began in full bloom, with no visible roots. Now, mainstream archaeology has explanations for this. They'll tell you that the earlier settlements must have been lost to erosion, buried under centuries of flooding, or destroyed by the shifting courses of the rivers. And maybe that's true. Maybe we just haven't found the evidence yet. But there's another possibility. One that the clay tablets themselves seem to suggest. One that makes you wonder if the Sumerians weren't inventing their civilization at all. What if they were remembering it? Let me tell you about something that happened to me once. I was looking at photographs of Sumerian tablets in a museum archive. High-resolution images that show every detail of the clay surface. And there, preserved for more than 5,000 years, I saw something that made time collapse. A fingerprint, the print of a thumb, pressed into the clay before it dried. The walls and ridges still visible, still unique, still carrying the identity of a person who lived 60 centuries ago. That person had a name, had a family, woke up in the morning and went to work pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, recording the grain deliveries or the temple offerings or maybe even the movements of the stars. And in that moment, 5,000 years vanished. That person wasn't ancient history. They were real as you or me. The clay tablets of Sumer are more than just records. They're witnesses, silent observers that remember everything, even when the cities that created them have turned to dust. Cuneiform isn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It's not flowing like Arabic or elegant like Chinese calligraphy. It's geometric, angular, made of triangular wedge shapes pressed into clay with a cut reed. But there's something profound about the way it works. Each sign is both a sound and a symbol, both phonetic and ideographic. It can represent a word, a syllable, or an entire concept, depending on context. It's a language that thinks in multiple dimensions at once. And the things they recorded, the sheer variety of human experience captured in hardened mud. There are business contracts, receipts for sheep and barley, tax records, complaints about shoddy copper shipments that sound exactly like a modern one-star review. There are school tablets where children practice their letters. You can see where they made mistakes, where the teacher corrected them, where they tried again. There are medical texts describing surgical procedures, treatments for infections, remedies for stomach ailments. Some of these remedies actually work, which modern researchers discovered only after translating the tablets and testing the compounds. There are astronomical diaries tracking the movement of Venus over years. The precision is stunning. The observations match what we know the planet actually did, verified by computer models of ancient skies. There are legal codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 years before the Common Era, is one of the oldest legal documents ever found. It's 300 years older than the famous Code of Hammurabi, but it's more sophisticated, more concerned with justice than revenge. And then there are the myths, the stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells of a king's quest for immortality. The Enuma Elish, which describes the creation of the world. The tales of Inanna, goddess of love and war, descending into the underworld. These aren't just stories. They're philosophy, theology, psychology. They ask the same questions we're still asking today. What does it mean to be human? What happens when we die? How should we live? What makes a good king? But here's what keeps pulling me back to those fingerprints in the clay. Those anonymous marks left by ordinary people doing ordinary work. Sometimes, when you look at these tablets in the right light, you can see the hesitations, places where the stylus paused, where the scribe wasn't quite sure of a sign and had to think, where they made a mistake and tried to smooth it over. You can see their humanity, their struggles, their moments of uncertainty, and you realize that they were just like us, trying to make sense of the world, trying to preserve what they knew, trying to leave something behind that would outlast them. The clay tablets survived because they were humble, because they were made of earth and water and sun, no metal to rust, no paper to rot, just mud, hardened by time. The Sumerians understood impermanence. They knew that cities fall, that kings die, that even gods can be forgotten. But they also knew that words, once written, take on a life of their own. That knowledge, once recorded, can sleep for millennia and wake up again when someone is ready to listen. Those fingerprints in the clay are still there, still waiting, still whispering their secrets to anyone patient enough to hear. And the secrets they whisper are stranger than anyone expected. Chapter 2. The Impossible Kings. There's a document that archaeologists found in the ruins of ancient Larsa and Nippur. At first glance, it looks like a straightforward historical record, a list of kings and how long they ruled. The kind of thing you'd find in any ancient civilization. But when scholars started translating it, they realized they were looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that doesn't make sense, something that, to this day, nobody can fully explain. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it's one of the most disturbing documents from the ancient world. Not disturbing in a violent way, disturbing in the way that makes you question everything you think you know about history, about time, about what's possible, because this isn't mythology. It's not a religious text. It's a bureaucratic record, written in the same straightforward style that the Sumerians used to count sheep and record grain shipments. No flowery language, no poetic embellishment, just names, cities, and numbers. And the numbers are impossible. The king list begins with a single line that echoes through history like a bell that won't stop ringing. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, descended from heaven, not established by men, not earned through conquest, descended, given, bestowed from above. And then come the names. The first 8 kings who ruled before the great flood swept across the world, and next to each name, the length of their reign, Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Ommen Luana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. The numbers go on like this, tens of thousands of years per reign. Impossibly long, absurdly long. The kind of numbers that make modern scholars shake their heads and label the whole thing as mythology. But here's what bothers me. Here's what should bother you. These aren't round numbers. They're not symbolic. 28,800 is oddly specific. 43,200 is precise. These aren't the numbers you use when you're making up a story about gods and heroes. These are the numbers you use when you're copying from an older record. When you're transcribing something that you believe to be factual. When you're doing your job as a scribe and faithfully preserving what the source material says, even if it doesn't make sense to you. And the Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They counted everything. Grain, sheep, clay bricks, temple offerings. They didn't round off. They didn't estimate. When a Sumerian scribe wrote down a number, they meant that exact number. So what are we supposed to do with this? How are we supposed to understand kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years? The scholars have tried. Oh, how they've tried. There are theories. Lots of theories. Each one attempting to make sense of the impossible. Theory 1. The numbers are astronomical. Maybe the Sumerians were recording celestial cycles, not human lifespans. The 28,800 years could represent some planetary alignment or lunar cycle that they were tracking. It's a clever idea. The Sumerians were excellent astronomers. They understood cycles. They tracked Venus with incredible precision. Maybe they were encoding astronomical data into their king list. But if that's true, why phrase it as kings ruling for specific periods? Why not just say this celestial cycle lasts this many years? Why frame it as a historical chronicle? Theory 2. The numbers are allegorical, symbolic. They represent the importance or prestige of each king, not actual time. A king who ruled for 40,000 years was 40 times more significant than a king who ruled for 1,000 years. Again, clever. But it doesn't fit with how the Sumerians used numbers everywhere else. They were literal-minded when it came to record keeping. Poetry was poetry. Accounting was accounting. And the king list reads like accounting. Theory 3. The numbers represent dynasties, not individuals. Each king is actually a family line or a series of rulers, and the scribe just used a single name to represent them all. This one almost works. Except the text explicitly calls them individuals. It gives them personal names. It describes specific deeds. And more importantly, after the flood, the numbers suddenly drop to something believable. Hundreds of years. Then decades. Then normal human lifespans. If the pre-flood numbers represented dynasties, why would the post-flood numbers represent individuals? The text doesn't change its style. It doesn't explain the shift. It just happens. And that shift is the most intriguing part of all. 8 kings, multiple tens of thousands of years each. A total of 241,200 years of recorded history before the flood. And then the flood comes. The text is blunt about it. Then the flood swept over. Just like that. Everything washes away. Cities, people, civilization itself, drowned beneath waters that covered the world. But kingship doesn't die. According to the text, after the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven again. The cycle begins anew. Only this time, the numbers are different. The first king after the flood is Jushur of Kish. His reign, 1,200 years. Still impossible by our standards. Still far beyond a human lifespan. But compared to 43,000 years, it's almost reasonable. Then the numbers keep dropping. The next few kings rule for hundreds of years. Then the reigns shorten further. 200 years. 90 years. 60 years. By the time we get to the historical period, to kings we can verify through other sources, the numbers have fallen into the normal human range. 30 years. 25 years. 12 years. It's as if time itself was slowly speeding up, or human lifespans were slowly shortening, or whatever was sustaining those impossibly long lives was gradually fading from the world. The flood serves as the dividing line. The moment when everything changed. When the old world ended and the new world began. When the impossible became merely extraordinary, and the extraordinary eventually became ordinary. And this flood, it's not unique to Sumer. It's everywhere. The same story, told again and again, across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes it. A man named Utnapishtim builds a boat to survive waters that drown the world. He saves his family and pairs of animals. After the waters recede, he releases birds to find dry land. Sound familiar? It should, because the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible follows the exact same pattern. Same flood, same boat, same birds, even some of the same phrasing, when you read the original languages. But it's not just the Middle East. The Hindu texts speak of Manu, who survives a great deluge. Chinese mythology tells of Gunyu taming the flood waters. Greek myths describe Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving when Zeus floods the earth. Mayan texts speak of a great flood that destroyed the previous world. Indigenous Australian stories. Native American legends. African oral traditions. The flood is everywhere. Always the same basic pattern. Rising waters. A few survivors. The end of an old world and the beginning of a new one. How do cultures separated by oceans remember the same catastrophe? How do peoples with no contact, no shared language, no trade routes, all tell the same story? Modern geology gives us a possible answer. At the end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, something happened. Maybe a comet impact, maybe rapid climate change, maybe massive volcanic eruptions. Whatever it was, it melted the ice sheets. Fast. The sea levels rose by hundreds of feet over just a few centuries. Coastlines where people had lived for thousands of years vanished underwater. Islands disappeared. River valleys flooded. Entire ecosystems drowned. If there were civilizations living on those coastlines, and all the evidence suggests there were, they would have been wiped out. Their cities are now hundreds of feet below the ocean surface. Their farms are buried under silt. Their stories survived only in the memories of the refugees who fled inland. And maybe that's what the Sumerian king list is recording. Not individual kings who lived for tens of thousands of years, but the deep memory of a world before the flood, a world that lasted far longer than our current civilization, a world where the rules were different, where life itself operated on a different scale. The Sumerians saw themselves as the heirs of that lost world, not the creators of civilization. The rebuilders, the ones who remembered just enough to start again, and those impossible numbers in the king list. Maybe they're not impossible at all. Maybe they're just measuring something we don't understand yet, recording a kind of time that doesn't exist anymore, preserving the echo of a world that drowned when the ancient ice melted and the waters rose to reclaim the land. The kings are still there, their names pressed into clay, their impossible reigns carefully recorded by scribes who believed what they were writing, and the flood still divides history, still marks the moment when everything changed, when the old world ended and we, the forgetful children of survivors, began again. Chapter 3. What they knew. Let's talk about what the Sumerians knew, not what they believed, not what they imagined, what they actually knew. Facts, measurements, mathematical truths that we've verified with modern instruments, because this is where the mystery deepens. This is where the impossible becomes undeniable. Start with something simple, something we use every single day without thinking about it. Time. Why are there 60 seconds in a minute? 60 minutes in an hour? Why not 10? Why not 100? Our entire modern world runs on the decimal system. Base 10. We count on our fingers. Our money works in tens. Our measurements, our mathematics, everything is built around the number 10, except time. Time still runs on 60. And it runs on 60 because the Sumerians decided, 5,000 years ago, that 60 was the perfect number. They used a base 60 mathematical system. Sexagesimal, scholars call it. And it wasn't arbitrary. 60 is mathematically elegant. It's divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. No other number below 100 has as many factors. This makes calculations easier. Fractions become simpler. You can divide a circle into clean segments. You can measure angles precisely. You can track the movements of celestial bodies with accuracy. The Sumerians understood this. 5,000 years before calculators, before algebra, before even the concept of zero, they built a mathematical system so efficient that we still use it today. Not because we chose to, because we inherited it. Because once the Sumerians set time to run on base 60, that rhythm echoed through every civilization that followed. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, the modern world. We live by Sumerian time. Every time you check your watch, you're using their mathematics. But why 60? Where did they get the idea? Most ancient cultures counted on their fingers. Base 10 came naturally. Base 20 made sense, if you counted toes too. But base 60? Some scholars suggest they were tracking lunar months against solar years. 12 lunar months don't quite match one solar year. But if you track 5 solar years, you get very close to 62 lunar months. Maybe 60 became sacred because it represented the harmony between moon and sun. Maybe. But that's a sophisticated insight for people who supposedly just figured out farming. And it's not just time. It's geometry. The circle divided into 360 degrees. Again, divisible by 60. The Sumerians mapped the sky this way, drew charts of the heavens with precision that let them predict eclipses, track planets, identify patterns in the cosmic dance above them. They weren't guessing. They were measuring, recording, calculating, with tools that shouldn't have given them the accuracy they achieved. Now let's talk about what they saw when they looked up at night, because this is where it gets truly strange. The Sumerians had charts, star charts, planetary tables, records of celestial movements spanning centuries. And when modern astronomers input this ancient data into computers, something remarkable happens. The data is accurate, not approximately accurate, not close enough for ancient times, actually accurate. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, for example. These are Babylonian copies of older Sumerian records. They track the rising and setting of Venus over 21 years. Every appearance, every disappearance, the exact number of days Venus remained visible or hidden. When astronomers calculated where Venus actually was during that period, using computer models that can reconstruct ancient skies, the Sumerian records matched perfectly, down to the day. How? Venus moves in complex patterns. It's not a simple cycle. Sometimes it appears as the morning star. Sometimes, as the evening star, it disappears behind the sun for weeks at a time. Tracking it requires careful, continuous observation over years, decades, generations. The Sumerians did this. Without telescopes, without cameras, without computers, just human eyes and clay tablets, and an obsessive dedication to recording what they saw. But Venus isn't even the most impressive part. They tracked Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, planets that move slowly against the background of stars, planets that require years of observation to understand. They named the constellations. Not all of them match what we use today, but many do. Taurus, the bull; Leo, the lion; Scorpio, the scorpion. These aren't Greek inventions. They're Sumerian. The Greeks inherited them, renamed a few, and passed them on to us. The zodiac itself. The 12 signs that mark the sun's path through the year. Sumerian. They divided the sky into 12 parts, because 12 is another beautiful number. Divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6. Easy to work with. Elegant. And here's something that really shouldn't be possible. Some scholars believe the Sumerians understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. This wobble makes the position of the stars shift gradually over centuries. It's barely noticeable in a human lifetime. You need sophisticated instruments or centuries of careful record-keeping to detect it. Did the Sumerians know about it? The evidence is debatable. Some of their texts seem to reference it. Some of their numbers match the precession cycle too closely to be coincidence. But we can't be sure. What we can be sure of is this. They were watching the sky with an intensity that borders on obsession. They were recording what they saw with meticulous care. And they were finding patterns that we didn't rediscover until we had telescopes and computers. Why? What were they looking for up there? What did they think the stars would tell them? The engineering is just as impressive, maybe more so, because you can still see the results today. Ruined, buried under sand, but still there, still defying easy explanation. The city of Uruk. At its height, it was the largest city in the world. 6 miles of walls, 40 feet high, made of baked brick. Not mud brick that would crumble in the rain. Baked brick, fired in kilns, strong enough to last 5,000 years. Inside those walls, temples rose toward the sky. Ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids dedicated to the gods. The largest, the Temple of Anu, stood on a platform that raised it above the entire city. You could see it from miles away, a mountain made by human hands. Building something like that requires mathematics. You need to calculate angles, distribute weight, ensure the foundation can support the structure. One mistake and the whole thing collapses. The ziggurats didn't collapse. Many are still standing. Damaged by time and war and weather, but standing. After 5,000 years, and they're aligned. The corners point to the cardinal directions with remarkable precision. North, south, east, west. How did they determine true north without compasses? How did they maintain that precision across such massive structures? They knew. Somehow, they knew. The irrigation systems are even more impressive. Canals that stretched for miles. Reservoirs that held water through the dry season. Dikes that controlled flooding. Gates that regulated flow. This isn't simple ditch digging. This is hydraulic engineering. You need to understand water pressure, flow rates, gradient, evaporation, soil erosion, all the factors that can make an irrigation system fail. And these systems didn't fail. They worked. They worked so well that they turned desert into farmland. They supported cities of tens of thousands of people. They created surplus food that allowed people to specialize, to become craftsmen, artists, priests, scribes, astronomers. The irrigation networks made civilization possible, and they appeared, fully functional, right at the beginning. No early attempts that failed. No learning curve. Just sophisticated water management from day one. Roads connected the cities. Not just dirt paths. Paved roads. With drainage systems so water wouldn't wash them away. Rest houses for travelers. Waypoints marking distances. They had postal systems. Messengers carrying clay tablets, sealed in clay envelopes. The seal would break if anyone tampered with the message. Ancient encryption. They had standardized weights and measures. A shekel meant the same thing in as it did in Uruk. You could trade across hundreds of miles and know you weren't being cheated because everyone used the same standards. Think about what that requires. Agreement between city-states that were often at war with each other. A central authority that could enforce standards. Mathematical precision in creating the weights. And the understanding that trade depends on trust, and trust depends on consistency. These aren't the insights of people stumbling through early civilization. These are the practices of people who understand how complex societies work, who've thought deeply about the infrastructure needed to support urban life. And they had it all, right from the start. The medicine is perhaps the most overlooked achievement, because we tend to think of ancient medicine as primitive, superstition and guesswork, prayers to gods and useless herbs. The Sumerian medical texts tell a different story. They describe surgical procedures, how to set broken bones, how to stitch wounds, how to remove cataracts from eyes, how to perform trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure. These are real techniques, dangerous techniques, the kind of thing that would kill the patient if you got it wrong. The texts also describe when to use these procedures, what symptoms to look for, how to recognize infections, how to manage pain. They understood that disease had natural causes, not just spiritual ones, that the body could be studied, understood, treated. They made medicines from plants, hundreds of different compounds, carefully described in their texts. Modern researchers have tested some of these ancient recipes. Many of them work, not because of magic, because the Sumerians had figured out through trial and error which plants contained useful chemicals. Willow bark for pain. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. The Sumerians didn't know about salicylic acid, but they knew willow bark helped with headaches and inflammation. They used honey on wounds. Modern medicine has rediscovered that honey has antibacterial properties. The Sumerians were using it as an antibiotic 4,000 years before we understood why it worked. They understood hygiene. They built public baths, drainage systems that carried waste away from living areas. They had laws about food preparation and storage, not because of germ theory, which wouldn't be discovered for millennia, but because they'd noticed that certain practices kept people healthier. Again, this is sophisticated thinking. This is empirical observation, trial and error over long periods, the kind of accumulated wisdom that should take centuries to develop. But where are the centuries of development? Where are the failed attempts? The cities with bad drainage that suffered plagues? The early surgical techniques that killed more patients than they saved? They're not there. Or if they are, we haven't found them. What we find is competence, knowledge, skill that appears fully formed. Then there's the Code of Ur-Nammu, 2100 years before the Common Era, the oldest known legal code in human history. It's not primitive. It's sophisticated, nuanced, concerned with justice, not just punishment. If a man cuts off another man's foot, he pays 10 shekels of silver. If a man knocks out another man's tooth, he pays 2 shekels. Specific, measured, proportional. But here's what's remarkable. The code makes distinctions based on intent. Accidental harm is treated differently from deliberate harm. That's a philosophical insight. It requires understanding that justice depends on more than just outcomes. It depends on what was in the person's heart. The code protects the vulnerable, widows, orphans, the poor. It sets limits on what the powerful can do. It establishes that even kings are subject to law. This is advanced political philosophy. The idea that law exists above individuals. That justice is a principle, not just the will of the strongest. That civilization requires protection for those who can't protect themselves. Where did these ideas come from? How did the Sumerians, supposedly at the dawn of civilization, understand concepts that most societies throughout history have failed to grasp? The laws also regulate commerce, contracts, property rights, inheritance, marriage and divorce. They create a framework for economic activity, for dispute resolution, for social stability. This is the infrastructure of civilization, the invisible architecture that makes complex society possible. And it's all there, in writing, 3,000 years before the Roman legal tradition that supposedly invented these concepts. Let me tell you about one more thing. One more piece of evidence that the Sumerians knew more than they should have. In the ruins of one ziggurat, archaeologists found a small clay cylinder. It's covered in text. A dedication to the goddess Inanna. Standard stuff. The kind of inscription you'd expect to find in a temple. But buried in the middle of the text is a single phrase that stops you cold. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration. Not creation. Not invention. Restoration. The rebuilding of something that already existed. The recovery of something that was lost. The Sumerians saw themselves as heirs, as preservers, as people who were remembering, not discovering, who were restoring an older order, not inventing a new one. This shows up again and again in their texts. References to the antediluvian cities, the cities before the flood, the knowledge of the ancestors, the wisdom of those who came before. They looked backward. They believed that truth was ancient, that the golden age was in the past, not the future, that they were living in a diminished time, trying to recover what had been lost. Modern civilization looks forward. We believe progress moves in one direction, that we're smarter than our ancestors. That knowledge accumulates, that we're at the peak of human achievement. The Sumerians believed the opposite. They thought they were rebuilding, recovering, remembering, that the peak was behind them, not ahead. What if they were right? What if their mathematics, their astronomy, their engineering, their medicine, their law? What if none of it was invented? What if it was all remembered? Preserved fragments of older knowledge, saved from the flood, passed down through generations, finally written on clay so it wouldn't be lost again. What if the Sumerians appeared fully formed because they weren't starting from scratch? Because they were the survivors, the inheritors, the keepers of secrets from a world that drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose and everything that came before was washed away. The clay tablets don't answer that question. They just keep whispering. 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle, Venus, rising and setting exactly as the ancient records predicted. Fingerprints pressed into mud 5,000 years ago. And somewhere in the silence between the cuneiform marks, you can almost hear it. The echo of something older, something that knew, something that the Sumerians were trying desperately to preserve before it was forgotten completely. Chapter 4. The Gods from the Sky. Now we need to talk about something that makes academics uncomfortable, something that gets whispered about in documentaries but rarely discussed in peer-reviewed journals, something that the Sumerians themselves wrote about constantly, matter-of-factly, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. The gods came from the sky. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The Sumerian texts are very specific about this. The gods descended from heaven to earth. They came down. They landed. They walked among humans. They taught. They ruled. They built. And when you read the actual texts, not the sanitized interpretations, not the academic translations that soften everything into mythology, but the raw cuneiform pressed into clay by people who believed what they were writing, something shifts in your understanding. These don't read like myths. They read like memories. The Anunnaki. That's what the Sumerians called them. The name means something like those who from heaven to earth came. And they weren't vague, distant deities living in some abstract spiritual realm. They were physical, present, involved in the daily affairs of the world. They had names. Anu, the Sky Father. Enlil, Lord of the Air. Enki, Lord of the Earth and Water. Inanna, later called Ishtar. Utu, the Sun God. Nana, the Moon God. Dozens more, each with specific roles, specific personalities, specific domains of authority. And here's what's strange. The texts describe them doing very ungodlike things. They eat, they drink, they get angry, they fall in love, they make mistakes, they argue with each other, they form factions, they compete for power. They sound less like gods and more like people. Very powerful people. People with advanced knowledge. People who came from somewhere else. People who, for reasons the texts don't fully explain, decided to create civilization in the fertile plains between two rivers. Let me read you something. This is from the Sumerian creation epic, the Atrahasis. I'm paraphrasing, but the essence is this. When the gods first came to Earth, they had to do all the work themselves. Digging canals, building cities, mining. It was hard labor, back-breaking labor. And the lesser gods, the ones doing the actual work, eventually rebelled. They went on strike. They refused to work anymore. So the senior gods, the ruling council, had a problem. They needed workers. Someone to do the labor. Someone to maintain the irrigation systems and work the fields and keep civilization running. Their solution? Create humans, not out of divine love, not as the pinnacle of creation, as workers, as servants, to do the jobs the gods themselves didn't want to do. The text is very specific about how this happened. Enki, the clever one, the scientist god, mixed clay with the blood of a slain god. Divine essence combined with earth. The result was humanity. Smart enough to follow instructions, strong enough to work, but mortal, limited, controlled. Now, you can read this as mythology, as a creation story that explains human nature and our relationship to the divine, and maybe that's all it is. But there's something about the tone, the matter-of-fact way it's presented, the practical problem-solving, the sense that this is describing something that actually happened, not a symbolic teaching about the human condition. It reads like a report, like someone documenting a procedure, like a historical record of genetic engineering. And that's a very uncomfortable thought, because if you take it literally, even for a moment, it suggests that human beings weren't the result of natural evolution. We were designed, created deliberately, engineered to fulfill a specific purpose. The texts say we were made to work the gold mines, to dig precious metals from the earth. Why gold? The Sumerians were obsessed with gold. They imported it from vast distances. They covered everything important in gold. Temple statues, royal jewelry, religious artifacts. But why? Gold is soft, useless for tools or weapons. Its only real value is that it doesn't tarnish. It lasts forever, and it conducts electricity better than almost any other metal. Did the Anunnaki need gold for some technological purpose? Were they mining resources for technology we don't understand? Is that why they created humans? To be a labor force for mining operations that would take thousands of years? These are questions that mainstream archaeology won't touch, but the texts are there, written in cuneiform, pressed into clay by scribes who had no reason to lie. Enki is particularly interesting. In many ways, he's the hero of Sumerian mythology, the rebel god, the one who sided with humanity. When the great flood was coming, when the other gods decided to wipe out humanity completely, Enki broke ranks. He warned a man named Sudra, told him to build a boat, to save his family and animals and seeds, to survive the catastrophe. Sound familiar? It should. This is the original flood story, the one that predates Noah by thousands of years. The one that got copied and modified by later cultures, but in the Sumerian version, it's not about divine judgment. It's about one god defying the others to save his creation. Enki is also credited with teaching humanity, writing, mathematics, agriculture, medicine, all the knowledge that makes civilization possible. He's described as giving these gifts to humans against the wishes of Enlil, who wanted to keep humanity ignorant and controllable. Again, this is a strange narrative for mythology. Gods usually don't disagree about fundamental policy. They don't have competing agendas. They don't form factions and work against each other. But if these weren't gods in the supernatural sense, if they were advanced beings, perhaps from another world, perhaps survivors from an earlier Earth civilization, then suddenly the conflicts make sense. Different individuals with different ideas about what to do with this new species they'd created. Some wanting to keep humans subordinate, others wanting to uplift them. Political disagreements among a ruling class. The texts describe the Anunnaki traveling between heaven and earth. They had vehicles. The texts call them boats of heaven. They made noise. They produced fire and smoke. They could carry the gods up to the sky and bring them back down. In one text, the goddess Inanna travels to the underworld. Before she can enter, She has to remove 7 articles of clothing or equipment. Scholars usually interpret this as symbolic, each piece representing a spiritual attribute she must abandon. But when you read the actual description, it sounds more like she's removing protective gear. A helmet, a breastplate, equipment that serves a function. And the underworld she's traveling to isn't described as a spiritual realm. It's described as a physical place, underground, dark, where the air is different. Could this be describing a journey into deep tunnels or caves, places where you'd need special equipment to survive? Mining operations, perhaps. I'm not saying that's definitely what it is. I'm saying the texts allow for that interpretation, and it's an interpretation that makes the stories more coherent, not less. Then there's the question of appearance. The Sumerian art shows the Anunnaki as humanoid, but distinctly different from regular humans. Taller, stronger, often wearing strange conical hats or helmets, holding objects that don't quite make sense, bags or containers that appear in image after image, but are never fully explained. In some depictions, they have wings, not bird wings, structured wings, mechanical looking, as if the artist was trying to draw something they didn't fully understand. Something that allowed the gods to fly but wasn't a natural part of their body. There are cylinder seals showing what looks like a solar system, with the sun in the center and planets orbiting around it. This was carved thousands of years before Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model, before anyone in the Western world understood that Earth orbits the sun. But the Sumerians knew. They drew it. They understood the solar system structure. How did they know? Who showed them? One seal is particularly controversial. It shows what appears to be 11 or 12 celestial bodies: sun, moon, and planets. But if you count the planets in our solar system as the ancients could see them with naked eye observation, you get 5. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. 6 if you count Earth. 7 with the moon. Where are the extra planets on this seal coming from? Some researchers claim it shows planets we didn't discover until modern times. Uranus, Neptune, even a hypothetical planet beyond Neptune that hasn't been confirmed yet. Mainstream scholars say this is overinterpretation, that the seal shows stars, not planets, that we're seeing patterns that aren't there. But the Sumerians were precise. They distinguished between stars and planets. They knew planets moved differently. They tracked them separately. If they carved something that looks like a solar system with extra planets, maybe they meant exactly that. Maybe someone showed them. Someone who could see the whole system from outside. Someone who traveled between worlds. I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm not saying ancient astronauts definitely visited Earth and created human civilization. That would be irresponsible. We don't have proof of that. What we have are texts. Thousands of them. Written by people who had no concept of science fiction. No cultural framework for making up stories about visitors from other worlds. They wrote what they believed to be true. What their ancestors had told them. What their priests taught them. What their oldest records said. And what they wrote, consistently, across thousands of years and hundreds of different scribes, is that the gods came from the sky. That they were physical beings. That they taught humans. That they created civilization. That they had technology that seemed magical. That they eventually left, but promised to return. You can explain this as mythology, as humanity's early attempt to understand natural forces by personifying them, as metaphors for the sun, the moon, the fertility of the earth. And maybe that's right. Maybe it's all symbolic. Maybe the Sumerians were poets, not historians. Maybe everything they wrote about the Anunnaki was spiritual teaching dressed up as narrative. But what if it's not? What if some of it, even a fraction of it, is based on actual events, actual encounters, actual knowledge passed down from a time we don't remember? Because here's the thing that keeps nagging at me. The Sumerians appeared with advanced knowledge, mathematical systems, astronomical precision, engineering capabilities, medical understanding, legal philosophy, all at once, fully formed. And their explanation for where that knowledge came from is consistent. It was given to them, taught to them, by beings who descended from heaven, by the Anunnaki. Either this is the most elaborate metaphor in human history, maintained across thousands of years by people who took it absolutely literally, or it's a memory, a preserved record of something that actually happened, something so far outside our current understanding of history that we've chosen to call it myth rather than face its implications. There's a third possibility, one that doesn't require ancient astronauts but is almost as radical. What if the Anunnaki weren't from another planet? What if they were from Earth, survivors of an earlier civilization, one that rose to great heights before the last ice age, one that was destroyed in the catastrophe that ended the Younger Dryas period around 11,600 years ago, a civilization that had developed technology, that understood astronomy and mathematics, that built cities we haven't found yet because they're under hundreds of feet of ocean, that saw the comet coming or the ice melting or whatever catastrophe erased them, and sent out survivors with instructions to preserve the knowledge. Those survivors would have seemed like gods to the primitive humans struggling to survive in the aftermath. They would have had knowledge, tools, understanding of principles that seemed magical. They could have taught farming, writing, mathematics, astronomy, could have helped build the first cities, could have ruled for a time until they died out, leaving behind only stories and the faint genetic trace of their presence. This theory explains the flood myths, the sudden appearance of civilization, the ancient knowledge, the sense that the Sumerians were rebuilding rather than inventing, and it doesn't require interstellar travel, just a lost chapter of human history, a civilization that rose and fell before our own. That left behind just enough evidence to whisper through the millennia. The underwater ruins that keep being found in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, off the coast of India, the massive stone structures that predate known civilization, the genetic anomalies that suggest human populations crashed and recovered about 12,000 years ago, the climate data showing rapid, catastrophic changes at the end of the Ice Age. Maybe the Anunnaki were us, an earlier version of us, one that reached heights we're only now approaching again, one that was wiped out by forces beyond their control, one that tried desperately to pass their knowledge on before it was lost forever. And maybe they succeeded. Maybe those survivors made it to Mesopotamia. Maybe they taught the locals what they knew. Maybe they were remembered as gods, because compared to Stone Age hunters, they might as well have been. Maybe the Sumerian civilization isn't the beginning of our story. Maybe it's chapter 2, and chapter 1 is still buried beneath the waves, waiting for us to develop the technology to find it. Or maybe it's both. Maybe there were survivors from Earth's lost civilization, and maybe they weren't alone. Maybe in the vastness of space and time, Earth has been visited before. Maybe knowledge came from multiple sources, internal and external, past and future, human and other. The Sumerians seem to believe in layers of reality, levels of existence. They wrote about the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the world, about the Duku, the holy mound where civilization began, about Dilmun, the paradise where the gods dwelt, about the paths between heaven and earth, travelled by beings who belonged to neither fully. These might be metaphors. They might be actual places, now lost or never found. They might be attempts to describe things the Sumerian language had no proper words for, technologies or concepts so foreign to their experience that they could only approximate them through poetry and symbol. What matters is this. The Sumerians themselves believed their civilization was a gift. Knowledge descended from above. Wisdom from beings greater than themselves. Their role was to preserve it, to write it in clay, to build it in stone, to pass it on, and they did. For thousands of years, they kept the flame alive. They copied the old tablets. They maintained the temples. They taught the mathematics and astronomy and law, until eventually they too were conquered, absorbed, forgotten, and the knowledge passed to Babylon, then Assyria, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then us. We're still using their numbers, still watching their stars, still asking their questions, still trying to understand where we came from and whether we're alone. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, whoever they were, left an impression that hasn't faded in 5,000 years. Left questions that still don't have answers. Left knowledge that still seems too advanced for its time. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the certainty of ancient astronauts or lost civilizations, but the uncertainty, the mystery, the sense that history is deeper and stranger than we've been taught, that the answers we've accepted might not be the only answers, that there are truths still buried in the clay, waiting for someone brave enough to read them without flinching. The gods came from the sky. That's what the Sumerians wrote, over and over, in text after text. Maybe they were right. Chapter 5. The Cultural Legacy. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Sumerians didn't just vanish. They transformed. Their language died. Their cities crumbled. Their empire fell. But their ideas are immortal. Every time you look at a clock, you're speaking Sumerian. Every time you draw a circle, you're using their geometry. Every time you read a story about a hero seeking immortality or a flood that destroys the world, you're hearing echoes of their myths. We think of ourselves as modern, advanced, beyond the ancient world, but scratch the surface of our civilization and you'll find Sumer, like a foundation buried so deep we've forgotten it's there. But it holds everything up. Let me show you what I mean. Writing, the thing you're doing right now if you're taking notes, the thing that makes this entire conversation possible, the ability to capture thoughts and preserve them beyond the moment, beyond the lifespan of the person who thought them. This is perhaps humanity's most important invention, more important than fire, more important than the wheel. Because writing creates continuity. It creates history. It makes civilization possible. And it started in Sumer. Around 3,300 years before the Common Era, in the city of Uruk, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and made marks that meant something. Not pictures, not simple representations, actual symbols that captured language. That could be read by anyone who knew the code. Cuneiform spread, modified, adapted. The Akkadians took it and used it for their language. Then the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Persians, each culture bent it to their needs, changed the symbols, adjusted the sounds. But the fundamental idea that you could represent speech with abstract marks, that you could create a visual code for language itself, that came from Sumer, and once that idea existed, it never went away. The Phoenicians simplified cuneiform into an alphabet. The Greeks adopted and modified the Phoenician alphabet. The Romans took the Greek alphabet and spread it across Europe. And here we are, thousands of years later, still using letters that trace their ancestry back to wedge marks in Sumerian clay. Every email, every text message, every book ever written in the Western world, all of it descends from that moment in Uruk when someone decided that thoughts were too important to let die with the thinker. The Sumerians created the first information age, the first time in human history when knowledge could accumulate faster than it could be forgotten, when one generation could build directly on the insights of the previous one, when ideas could spread across distance and time. Everything that came after, everything we call civilization, depends on that innovation, on the simple, radical idea that words can be captured, frozen, preserved. Then there are the stories, the myths, the epics, and this is where it gets really interesting, because Sumerian stories didn't just influence later cultures, they became the template. The original versions that every culture after them copied, modified, and retold. The Epic of Gilgamesh. You've probably heard of it. The oldest written story in human history, carved into clay tablets around 4,000 years ago, but telling a story that's even older, a story that was already ancient when it was first written down. Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, according to the text. A tyrant, a warrior, a man who feared nothing except death. The story follows his journey from arrogant king to humbled seeker. He befriends Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to be his equal. Together, they have adventures. They fight monsters. They insult the gods. And then Enkidu dies. Suddenly, unfairly. And Gilgamesh, who never feared anything, discovers terror, because if Enkidu can die, then so can he. His power, his strength, his divine heritage, none of it protects him from the one enemy he can't fight. So he goes searching for immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth. He crosses the waters of death. He finds the one human who survived the great flood and was granted eternal life. And he asks for the secret. The secret, it turns out, is that there is no secret. Death is the fate of humanity. The gods kept immortality for themselves. The best we can do is leave something behind. A name, a deed, a story that outlives us. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He doesn't find immortality, but he finds something else. Purpose. He builds walls that will stand for thousands of years. He creates a city that will be remembered. He becomes the subject of a story that will be told and retold until the end of time. And here's the thing. This story, this 4,000-year-old tale, pressed into clay by Sumerian scribes, contains every theme that Western literature has been exploring ever since. The hero's journey, the search for meaning, the confrontation with mortality, the value of friendship, the dangers of pride, the acceptance of limitation, the desire to leave a legacy. Homer's Odyssey. It's borrowing from Gilgamesh. The Greek myths of heroes seeking glory. They're echoes of Sumerian stories. The Bible's tale of Noah. It's a direct adaptation of the flood story in Gilgamesh, which itself was adapted from even older Sumerian accounts. Every story about a hero who goes on a quest, faces impossible challenges, loses everything, and returns transformed. Every story about the search for eternal life. Every story about friendship between warriors. Every story about defying the gods. They all lead back to Sumer. To clay tablets pressed by hands that turned to dust thousands of years ago. To stories that survived because they captured something essential about what it means to be human. The religious influence is even more pervasive. So deep that we don't even notice it anymore. The Sumerian gods weren't like modern conceptions of God. They weren't all-powerful. They weren't all-knowing. They weren't even particularly moral. They were more like a dysfunctional family with superpowers. Petty, jealous, playing favorites, making mistakes. But the structure of Sumerian religion, the framework, that's what lasted. They believed in a heaven above and an underworld below. The gods lived in the sky. The dead went beneath the earth. This vertical cosmology, with spiritual realms stacked above and below the physical world, became the standard model. They believed in divine judgment, that the gods rewarded good behavior and punished bad, that your actions in life determined your fate. This idea, that the universe has a moral structure, that justice is built into the fabric of reality, this came from Sumer. They believed in intermediaries, priests who could speak to the gods, temples where the divine and human worlds touched, rituals that could invoke divine favor. This entire structure of organized religion, with its hierarchies and ceremonies and sacred spaces, the Sumerians invented it. And then there's the concept that really changed everything. The idea of divine kingship. In Sumer, the king wasn't just a political leader. He was the representative of the gods on earth, chosen by heaven, invested with divine authority. His laws weren't just his opinions. They were expressions of cosmic order. To disobey the king was to defy the gods themselves. This idea spread. Egypt adopted it. Their pharaohs became living gods. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, they all had god-kings. The Roman emperors declared themselves divine. European monarchs claimed to rule by divine right. Even today, even in democracies, we see traces of this. The reverence for leaders. The sense that political authority comes from something higher than mere human agreement. The symbolic power of crowns and thrones and coronations. It all goes back to Sumer, to the belief that kingship descended from heaven, that some people are chosen to rule. That political hierarchy reflects cosmic hierarchy. You can trace monotheism back to Sumer too. Not directly. The Sumerians were thoroughly polytheistic, but the structure was there. The idea of a supreme god, Anu, the Sky Father, who ruled over all the other gods, who rarely intervened directly, but whose authority was absolute. Over time, as cultures evolved, that supreme god absorbed the functions of all the others. The many became one. Polytheism gave way to monotheism, but the framework, the idea of a hierarchy of divine beings with a single authority at the top, that came from Sumerian religion, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the three great monotheistic religions, all of them emerged from the Middle East. All of them from cultures that had been influenced by Mesopotamian thought. All of them carrying Sumerian ideas in their DNA, even if they'd forgotten the source. Architecture tells the same story, of Sumerian innovations spreading outward, being copied, being refined, but never entirely lost. The ziggurat, the stepped pyramid, the Sumerians built them as temples, artificial mountains where earth met heaven, where the gods could descend and humans could ascend, where the barrier between realms became thin. This design didn't stay in Mesopotamia. You see stepped pyramids in Egypt. Different style, different purpose, but the same basic idea. A massive structure that elevates the sacred. That demonstrates power through scale. You see them in Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec pyramids, built thousands of miles from Sumer, built thousands of years later, but following the same principle, step by step, ascending to the sky. Coincidence, parallel development, or the echo of an idea so powerful that it spread across oceans and centuries. The Sumerians understood something fundamental about architecture, that buildings aren't just shelter, they're statements, they're symbols. They shape how people feel, how they understand their place in the cosmos. A ziggurat isn't efficient. It's not the best way to create indoor space. But efficiency isn't the point. The point is to inspire awe, to make humans feel small, to create a physical representation of hierarchy, gods above, humans below. The structure itself teaching theology. Modern architecture still does this. Cathedrals that soar toward heaven, government buildings with imposing facades, corporate headquarters that dominate skylines. We're still using architecture to express power, to inspire emotion, to make statements about order and authority. The techniques changed. Steel and glass instead of mud brick. But the psychology is Sumerian. The idea of urban planning, that cities should be designed rather than just evolved, that comes from Sumer too. They laid out their cities in grids. Organized space, designated areas for different functions, to residential quarters, commercial districts, temple complexes, government centers. This is so normal to us now that we don't think about it. But it was revolutionary. It required seeing the city as a whole, understanding how different parts related to each other, thinking about flow, about function, about the relationship between form and purpose. Every planned city in the world, from ancient Rome to modern New York, is following the Sumerian model. Streets in grids, zones for different activities, public spaces designed to serve specific functions. They even understood infrastructure, sewage systems, drainage, water supply, all buried beneath the city, all invisible, all essential. This is sophisticated thinking. This is seeing beyond the immediate and visible, understanding that a city is an organism, that it needs circulation. That waste must be removed, that water must flow in and out, that the unseen systems are as important as the visible structures. Modern civil engineering is more advanced, but it's not more insightful. The Sumerians understood the principles. They just had different tools. And then there's the law, the legal codes, the concept of written justice. The Code of Ur-Nammu isn't just a historical curiosity. It's the foundation of every legal system that came after it. The idea that laws should be written down, made public, applied equally. This was radical. Before written law, justice was personal, based on tradition, on the judgment of elders, on the will of the powerful. It was fluid, changeable, subject to interpretation and bias. Written law changes everything. It creates accountability. If the law is written, you can point to it. You can say this is what the law says. You can argue that even the king is subject to it. That justice exists independent of power. This concept spread from Sumer through every civilization that followed. Hammurabi's code, 300 years later, is more famous, but it's building on Sumerian foundations. The laws of Moses in the Hebrew Bible, the Roman 12 tables, the Magna Carta, the E's 4, constitution, all of them rest on the Sumerian innovation. That law can be written, that justice can be codified, that rights can be documented and protected, and the specific ideas in those Sumerian laws, proportional punishment, distinction between intentional and accidental harm, protection for the vulnerable, compensation for injury, regulation of commerce, these aren't primitive concepts. They're the building blocks of modern jurisprudence. We've refined them, made them more detailed. But the core insights, those came from Sumer. The idea of contracts, written agreements, business deals documented and enforceable. This enabled complex economies, made long-distance trade possible, created trust between strangers. Without enforceable contracts, you can only do business with people you know personally, people whose word you trust. But with written contracts, backed by law, you can trade with anyone. Distance doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. The contract persists. This innovation created the possibility of large-scale commerce, of banking, of investment, of all the complex economic systems that make modern life possible. And it started in Sumer, with clay tablets documenting who owed what to whom, with legal codes that made those debts enforceable, with courts that could interpret disputes. We take this for granted. We assume that economic transactions naturally get documented, that contracts are normal. But they're not natural. They're invented. And the invention happened in Sumer. Even our calendar is Sumerian. Not directly. We use the Gregorian calendar, which descended from the Roman calendar, which was influenced by the Egyptian calendar. But the underlying mathematics, the way we divide time, that's Sumerian. 12 months in a year, because 12 is a perfect number, divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6. The Sumerians loved 12. 60 is just 12 times 5. 360 degrees is 60 times 6, or 12 times 30. Their base 60 math allowed them to divide time and space with elegant precision. And we inherited that precision. We're still using it. Still dividing hours into 60 minutes. Still dividing circles into 360 degrees. Even the 7-day week. That's from Mesopotamia. Based on the 7 celestial bodies visible to the ancient eye: Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. Each one got a day. Each day named for a planet. In English, we can still see it. Sunday, Monday, Saturday. The other days are named for Norse gods, but those gods were matched to Roman gods, who were matched to Babylonian gods, who inherited the system from Sumer. Everything connects. Everything traces back. Peel away the layers, and you find Sumer. Again and again. The foundation beneath the foundation. Mathematics, science, literature, law, architecture, religion, urban planning, economics, timekeeping. Every aspect of what we call civilization has Sumerian DNA. We are, in a very real sense, still living in the world the Sumerians created. We've built on their foundation. We've added floors and wings and towers. We've modernized. We've improved. But the foundation is still there, still holding everything up. 5,000 years later, we check the time on devices they couldn't imagine. But the time we're checking runs on their numbers. We navigate using satellites orbiting the planet, but the degrees we use to measure direction and position are theirs. We write on glowing screens instead of clay, but the alphabet we use descends from their innovation. We live in cities of steel and glass, but the urban planning principles are theirs. We create laws to govern complex societies, but the concepts of written law and proportional justice are theirs. The Sumerians didn't just create a civilization. They created the template for civilization. Every culture that came after them, whether they knew it or not, was following patterns first established in the mud brick cities between 2 rivers. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not how they knew so much, but how thoroughly their knowledge spread, how completely their innovations were adopted, how deeply their ideas burrowed into human consciousness, to the point where we don't even recognize them anymore, where we think of these ideas as natural, universal, self-evident, but they're not. They're Sumerian, and they've been whispering through history for 5,000 years, shaping everything we are, everything we've become. The Sumerians built in clay because clay was what they had, but their ideas, those were built to last forever, and so far they have. Chapter 6. The Collapse. Every civilization falls. It's the one constant in human history. Empires rise, cities flourish, knowledge accumulates. And then, for reasons that often seem inevitable in hindsight but were invisible at the time, it all comes crashing down. Sumer was no different. After 2,000 years of dominance, after creating the template for civilization itself, the Sumerian world came to an end. But here's what's haunting about it. The collapse wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was slow, gradual, a series of small failures that compounded over centuries until the entire system could no longer sustain itself. And if you look closely at how Sumer fell, you start to see patterns, warnings, the same mistakes repeated across history, the same blind spots, the same fatal assumptions that every great civilization seems to make just before it dies. The beginning of the end started with success. That's how it always begins. Sumer was thriving. The city-states were wealthy. The irrigation systems produced abundant crops. Trade brought in luxury goods from across the known world. The population was growing. Cities were expanding. Everything seemed perfect. But underneath that prosperity, cracks were forming. Invisible, at first. Easy to ignore. But growing wider with each passing year. The city-states were competing, not just economically, militarily. Each one wanted to be the dominant power. Each one wanted control of the best farmland, the most profitable trade routes, the richest temples. At first, this competition was manageable. Occasional skirmishes, border disputes, the kind of conflict that's normal between neighbors. But it escalated. Wars became more frequent, more brutal, more destructive. Ur fought against Uruk. Lagash battled Umma. Kish struggled with Nippur. The same people, speaking the same language, worshipping the same gods, turned on each other with increasing violence. And here's the tragedy. They all knew they were Sumerians. They all shared the same culture, the same history, the same identity, but they couldn't overcome their political divisions, couldn't see that by weakening each other, they were weakening themselves. Resources that should have gone to maintaining the irrigation systems went to building armies. Manpower that should have been farming was fighting. Trade routes that connected the cities became battlegrounds. The wars didn't destroy Sumer directly, but they made Sumer vulnerable. They created opportunities for enemies, and enemies were gathering. To the north, the Akkadians were watching. Semitic people, different from the Sumerians in language and culture, but close enough geographically to understand what Sumer represented. Wealth, knowledge, power. Around 2,300 years before the Common Era, an Akkadian king named Sargon decided to do something unprecedented. He didn't just want to raid Sumer, he wanted to conquer it, to unite all the warring city-states under a single ruler, to create something that had never existed before, an empire. Sargon was brilliant, a military genius. He understood that the Sumerian city-states were too busy fighting each other to unite against a common threat. He picked them off one by one, conquered their armies, occupied their cities, installed his own governors. Within a few decades, Sumer was no longer independent. The city-states still existed. The temples still functioned. Trade continued. But political power had shifted. The Akkadians were in charge. And here's what's interesting. Sargon didn't try to destroy Sumerian culture. He embraced it. He adopted their writing system, their mathematics, their laws, their gods. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate Mesopotamian ruler, as someone continuing the tradition, not ending it. His scribes wrote in both Akkadian and Sumerian. His monuments honored Sumerian gods. His legal codes were based on Sumerian precedents. He was absorbing Sumer, not annihilating it. This is how cultures really die. Not in dramatic battles, not in burning cities and slaughtered populations, but in slow assimilation, in the gradual replacement of one language with another, one set of customs with another, one identity with another. The Sumerian language began to fade. It remained the language of religion and scholarship, the way Latin did in medieval Europe, but it stopped being the language of daily life, stopped being the language children learned from their mothers. Within a few generations, to speak Sumerian was to be educated, elite, old-fashioned, and then it became rare, and then it became extinct. The last known text, written in Sumerian, dates to around 100 years before the Common Era, 2,000 years after Sargon's conquest, 2,000 years of gradual decline, of fewer and fewer people who could read the old tablets, who could understand the ancient texts, who could keep the language alive. And then, silence. The language that created writing, that recorded the first laws and the first epics and the first astronomical observations, the language of Gilgamesh and Enki and the king list, gone, dead, preserved only in clay. But the conquest wasn't the only problem. There was something else, something more insidious, something that the Sumerians did to themselves. The irrigation systems that made Sumer possible were slowly poisoning the land. Here's how it works. When you irrigate desert soil, you're bringing water from the rivers to the fields. The water allows crops to grow, but the water also contains dissolved salts. Small amounts, trace quantities, nothing that seems dangerous. In natural conditions, rain would wash those salts away. But in an irrigated desert, there's no rain. The water comes from canals. It soaks into the soil. The crops absorb what they need. The rest evaporates. And when water evaporates, it leaves the salt behind. Year after year, century after century, the salt accumulates. The soil becomes saline, toxic, less productive. At first, you don't notice. The land is so fertile that a little salt doesn't matter. But it's cumulative. Decade by decade, the crop yields decline. Slightly, almost imperceptibly. But consistently, the Sumerians tried to compensate. They irrigated more, brought in more water. But more water meant more salt. They were trapped in a cycle. The solution was making the problem worse. By 2100 years before the Common Era, the agricultural records show the change. Wheat, which had been a staple crop, was failing, too sensitive to salt. Barley, which tolerates salt better, became the dominant crop, but even barley yields were dropping. The cities needed food. The population was growing, but the land was producing less. Famine became more common. Food prices rose. Social tensions increased. And here's the cruel irony. The same irrigation technology that created Sumerian civilization was destroying it. The same ingenuity that turned desert into farmland was turning farmland back into desert. Just a different kind of desert. One poisoned by salt instead of starved of water. The Sumerians knew this was happening. Their records document the declining yields. They tried different crops, different irrigation technique. They dug deeper canals, built more reservoirs, but they couldn't stop it, couldn't reverse it. The process was too slow to trigger urgent action, too gradual to force fundamental change. Each generation thought they could manage, could adapt, could delay the reckoning, until they couldn't. Then the climate changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough. Around 2200 years before the Common Era, the rainfall patterns shifted. The region became drier. The rivers carried less water. Droughts became more frequent, more severe. For a civilization entirely dependent on irrigation, this was catastrophic. Less water in the rivers meant less water for the canals, less water for the crops, less food for the cities. The Akkadian Empire, which had replaced Sumerian political power, collapsed under the strain. Famine, migration, chaos. Cities were abandoned. Trade routes broke down. The centralized government dissolved. This is when the Gutians invaded from the mountains. Tribal people, warriors. They swept through Mesopotamia, conquering the weakened cities, destroying what they couldn't use, taking what they wanted. The classical Sumerian world, already fading, suffered another blow. More cities abandoned, more knowledge lost. More connections severed. There was a brief revival. Around 2100 years before the Common Era, the city of Ur reasserted itself. The third dynasty of Ur, the last great flowering of Sumerian culture. They rebuilt, restored temples, compiled the old texts, tried to recapture the glory of earlier times. For about a century, it worked. Ur was magnificent again, a reminder of what Sumer had been. But it was a sunset, not a sunrise. The underlying problems hadn't been solved. The soil was still saline. The climate was still unstable. The political fragmentation was still ongoing. And then came the Amorites, another wave of Semitic invaders. They conquered Ur around 2,000 years before the Common Era. The third dynasty fell. The city was sacked. The temples were desecrated. That was effectively the end. Sumer, as an independent political entity, ceased to exist. The cities survived. Babylon rose to prominence. Mesopotamian civilization continued, but it was no longer Sumerian. The language, the culture, the identity, they were fading into history. The final blow was the river itself. The Euphrates changed course. Rivers do this. Especially in flat landscapes like southern Mesopotamia, the channels shift, meander, find new paths. It's natural, inevitable over geological time. But for cities built on the assumption that the river would always be there, it's fatal. Imagine your city depends entirely on a river for water, for trade, for waste removal, for irrigation. Your entire infrastructure is built around that river. Your canals connect to it. Your docks are positioned for it. Your fields are oriented toward it. And then the river moves. Not instantly. Gradually, the main channel shifts half a mile, then a mile, then 2 miles. The water level drops. The docks become useless. The canals run dry. The fields wither. You can't move the city. The buildings are there. The walls are there. The temples are there. Moving is impossible. So you try to adapt. Dig new canals. Extend the old ones. Work harder for less water. But there's a limit. Eventually, the river is too far away. The effort required to bring water to the city exceeds what the city can sustain. And so the city dies. Not violently, not suddenly. It just empties. People leave. Move to cities where the river still flows, where water is still available. This happened across southern Mesopotamia. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were abandoned within a few generations. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, the great centers of Sumerian civilization. They didn't fall to armies. They died of thirst. By 1,600 years before the Common Era, most of the classical Sumerian cities were deserted. The buildings remained. The temples still stood. But there were no people, no life, just ruins in the desert. Monuments to a civilization that had mastered water and then been betrayed by it. So what killed Sumer? War, invasion, environmental collapse, climate change, river migration. All of them. None of them. It's never just one thing. Civilizations are complex systems. They depend on countless factors all working together. Agriculture, trade, climate, politics, technology, culture. When the system is healthy, it can absorb shocks, survive droughts, recover from wars, adapt to change. But when the system weakens, when multiple stresses compound, when the buffers erode, then relatively small problems can trigger cascading failures. The city-state rivalries weakened Sumer's ability to respond to external threats. The Akkadian conquest changed the political structure. The salinization undermined food security. The climate shift strained resources. The invasions disrupted trade. The river migration removed the foundation. Everything else was built on. Each problem made the others worse. Each crisis reduced the capacity to handle the next one, until the whole system collapsed. And here's what should terrify us. These weren't unique problems. These are the same challenges every civilization faces. Political division, resource depletion, environmental degradation, climate variability, external threats, infrastructure failure. Sumer fell because they couldn't solve these problems, couldn't overcome their divisions, couldn't reverse the environmental damage, couldn't adapt fast enough to changing conditions. They were brilliant. They created writing and mathematics and law and astronomy. They built cities that lasted thousands of years. They developed technologies we still use. But brilliance wasn't enough. Knowledge wasn't enough. Even their sophisticated understanding of irrigation and agriculture couldn't save them from the long-term consequences of their own success. The very systems that made Sumer great were the systems that destroyed it. The irrigation that created abundance also poisoned the soil. The cities that concentrated power also created targets for invasion. The specialization that enabled advancement also created vulnerability to disruption. Success contained the seeds of failure, and the Sumerians, for all their wisdom, couldn't escape that trap. By the time the last Sumerian speaker died, sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, the civilization had been gone for nearly 2,000 years. The cities were buried under sand. The tablets were scattered and forgotten. The knowledge was lost. But not entirely. Never entirely. Because even in death, even in collapse, even in complete civilizational failure, ideas persist. Knowledge seeps into other cultures. Innovations get adopted by successors. Sumer fell. But the world Sumer created continued, and continues still. Chapter 7. The Modern Echo. There's a room in the British Museum. Quiet. Climate-controlled. Filled with glass cases containing fragments of clay. Thousands of them. Some no bigger than your thumb. Others the size of paperback books. All covered in wedge-shaped marks that nobody could read for 2,000 years. And in an office nearby, a computer hums. Running algorithms. Processing images. Analyzing patterns. The digital age has reached ancient Sumer, and something extraordinary is happening. Archaeologists and computer scientists are working together on a project that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. They're using artificial intelligence to read cuneiform, to translate tablets that have sat in museum storage for over a century, to decode texts that human scholars never had time to examine. There are hundreds of thousands of these tablets, maybe millions, scattered across museums and private collections worldwide. Each one a potential window into Sumerian life. But there aren't enough Assyriologists in the world to translate them all. The work would take centuries, so they're teaching machines to do it. Feeding AI systems thousands of already translated tablets, training neural networks to recognize cuneiform signs, to understand grammar, to make educated guesses about damaged or unclear passages. And it's working. The algorithms are getting better, faster. They're starting to translate texts that humans haven't been able to crack. They're finding patterns that human eyes missed. They're bringing Sumerian voices back to life at a pace that would have been impossible before. This is deeply ironic. The Sumerians created writing to preserve knowledge, to fight against forgetting. They pressed their words into clay because clay lasts, because they wanted future generations to remember. I think about those fingerprints sometimes, the ones pressed into clay 6,000 years ago, still visible, still unique, still carrying the identity of a person whose name we'll never know. That person lived a life, had thoughts, felt emotions, loved people, feared death, wondered about the stars, just like we do. The details of their life are lost. We don't know if they were happy, whether they had children, what dreams kept them awake at night, but their fingerprint remains. To create systems that could preserve and process knowledge beyond human memory's capacity. In a strange way, AI translation of cuneiform is the ultimate validation of their invention. Writing worked. It preserved their words across an impossible gulf of time, and now technology they couldn't have conceived is proving them right. But it's not just translation. Digital technology is transforming Sumerian archaeology in ways that feel almost magical. Archaeologists are using satellite imagery to find buried cities, special cameras that can detect variations in soil moisture and vegetation. Places where ancient walls lie beneath the sand show up as faint lines from orbit, invisible from ground level, obvious from space. They've found dozens of unknown sites this way, settlements that never made it into historical records, cities that might predate even the earliest known Sumerian civilization. all still buried, waiting. Ground-penetrating radar lets them map what's underground without digging. They can see building layouts, street patterns, temple foundations, all while the site remains untouched beneath the surface. It's like having X-ray vision for archaeology. 3D scanning is preserving artifacts with perfect precision. Every crack, every mark, every fingerprint pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, captured digitally, stored in servers, backed up in multiple locations. This is important because the physical tablets are fragile. They're crumbling. Museums can slow the decay but not stop it. In another few centuries, many of these artifacts will be dust, but their digital copies will remain. Perfect replicas that can be studied, printed, shared. The tablets may die, but the information they contain will be immortal. The Sumerians would appreciate this too. They understood impermanence. They knew that clay, for all its durability, doesn't last forever. They would understand the need to copy information to more permanent media, to ensure the knowledge survives even when the original medium fails. We're doing for their tablets what they did for their oral traditions, translating from one medium to another, from sound to clay, from clay to digital. Each translation an act of preservation, each copy a hedge against loss. And here's where it gets really interesting. The parallels between Sumerian information technology and modern information technology. They wrote on clay tablets. We write on servers. Both are attempts to create permanent records. Both are vulnerable to different kinds of damage. Clay can break. Servers can fail. They stored tablets in libraries. We store data in the cloud. Both are centralized repositories of knowledge. Both require organization, cataloging, systems to find what you need among millions of items. They had scribes whose job was to copy important texts, to make duplicates. To ensure that knowledge existed in multiple locations, we have backup systems. Redundancy. The same principle. Preserve multiple copies because single points of failure are dangerous. They developed cuneiform as a code to represent language. We developed binary as a code to represent information. Both are abstract symbol systems. Both translate meaning into marks that can be stored and transmitted. They worried about tablets being destroyed. By fire, by flooding, by conquest. We worry about data loss, hard drive crashes, cyber attacks, electromagnetic pulses. The threats are different, but the fear is the same. That everything we've recorded could vanish. That knowledge could be lost. And here's the uncomfortable question. Are we better at preservation than they were? Their clay tablets lasted 5,000 years. Will our hard drives last 50? Their libraries survived the collapse of their civilization. Will our data centers survive ours? Physical media decays, but it decays slowly, predictably. You can see a tablet crumbling. You can take steps to preserve it before it's too late. Digital media fails suddenly, completely. One moment the data is there, the next moment it's gone. No warning, no gradual decay, just catastrophic loss. And digital data requires infrastructure to read. A Sumerian tablet, if you know cuneiform, can be read with just your eyes. No technology needed, no power source, no compatible hardware, but a hard drive from the 1980s. We're already losing the ability to read those. The interfaces are obsolete. The file formats are forgotten. The data is still there, physically encoded on the disk, but we can't access it. What happens in 100 years? Will anyone remember how to read our current storage formats? Will the technology still exist? Or will our digital archives be as inaccessible as cuneiform was before the translation breakthrough in the 1800s? We assume our information will last forever because copies are easy to make. But copies only help if someone remembers to keep making them. If the systems that enable copying keep functioning, if there's continuity. The Sumerians understood this. They didn't just write things down once. They copied important texts over and over, across centuries, because they knew that preservation requires effort, continuous effort, that nothing lasts unless someone actively maintains it. We've forgotten that lesson. We think because we have technology, preservation is automatic. that the cloud is forever. That digital means immortal. But the cloud is just someone else's server. And servers require power, maintenance, companies that stay in business, infrastructure that doesn't collapse. Take away those things and the cloud evaporates. The data vanishes. Not gradually, instantly. There's another parallel. Between Sumerian city-states and modern networks, Sumer wasn't a unified empire. It was a network of independent cities, each one autonomous, each one connected to the others through trade and culture and shared language, but politically separate, often competing, sometimes cooperating. The internet is structured the same way. Independent networks connected through protocols, autonomous systems that talk to each other, no central authority, no single point of control. Distributed power. This structure has advantages. Resilience. If one city-state fell, the others continued. If one network goes down, the others route around it. No single failure can kill the whole system. But it also has weaknesses. Coordination is difficult. Common threats are hard to address. Individual parts can optimize for themselves in ways that harm the whole. The Sumerian city-states couldn't overcome their rivalries, couldn't unite against external threats until it was too late. They were too focused on local competition to see the systemic dangers. Are we making the same mistake? Nations competing in cyberspace, tech companies fighting for dominance, everyone optimizing for their own advantage, while larger threats, climate change, resource depletion, environmental collapse, go unaddressed because there's no mechanism for collective action. The parallels are uncomfortable. Sophisticated technology, complex systems, brilliant innovations, but underlying structural problems that brilliance can't solve, can't even see until they've already caused catastrophic damage. Let's talk about irrigation and the internet, about unintended consequences, about systems that create the problems they're designed to solve. Sumerian irrigation was miraculous. It turned desert into farmland, fed millions of people, made cities possible. It was the foundation of everything. But it poisoned the soil. Slowly, invisibly, the very system that created abundance was destroying the capacity for future abundance. And by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late to stop. The damage was cumulative, irreversible on human timescales. Social media is like that. It connected billions of people, made information sharing instant and global, created communities that transcend geography. It's miraculous, revolutionary, the foundation of modern communication, but it's poisoning something. Social cohesion, maybe. Attention spans, the ability to think deeply, the capacity for nuanced thought, mental health, particularly in young people, political discourse, the shared sense of reality that democracies depend on. The damage is cumulative, gets worse over time. Each generation more affected than the last. And we can see it happening. We document it. We study it. We worry about it. But we don't stop. Can't stop. We're too dependent on the system, too invested in it, too locked into the infrastructure. Just like the Sumerians couldn't abandon irrigation, even when they knew it was killing the land. This is the trap of complex systems. The solution becomes the problem. But you can't give up the solution because you need what it provides. So you keep using it. Keep hoping you can mitigate the damage. Keep telling yourself that technology or innovation or better management will fix it. Sometimes it does. Sometimes civilizations find ways to adapt, to solve the problems their own success created. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes the damage is too deep, the change is too fundamental, the inertia too strong. The Sumerians didn't save themselves. The salinization continued. The soil died. The cities emptied. Brilliance wasn't enough. Will we save ourselves? Will we find ways to preserve the benefits of digital connection while avoiding the poisoning of social fabric? Or will future archaeologists sift through our ruins, wondering why we couldn't see what was happening? Why we didn't change course when we still had time? There's a project happening right now in Svalbard, Norway. On an island in the Arctic, they're building a seed vault, a repository for genetic material from every crop plant on Earth. buried deep in a mountain, protected from war, climate change, every disaster they can imagine. It's called the Doomsday Vault, and it's our civilization's attempt to do what the Sumerians tried to do: preserve knowledge against catastrophe. Ensure that if everything falls apart, if civilization collapses, the survivors will have what they need to rebuild. Seeds instead of clay tablets, but the same impulse, the same fear, that everything we've built could be lost, that knowledge could die, that future generations might have to start over from nothing. We know this can happen, because it's happened before. Repeatedly, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the Mayan abandonment, the countless civilizations that rose and fell, leaving only fragments behind. Sumer teaches us that no amount of sophistication protects you, that you can invent writing and mathematics and astronomy and law and still collapse. That knowledge alone doesn't save you, but it also teaches us that knowledge can survive, that even when civilizations die, ideas persist, that the future inherits pieces of the past, that nothing is truly lost as long as someone remembers to preserve it. The question is what we choose to preserve, and whether we preserve it in ways that will actually survive what's coming. Clay tablets worked. They lasted 5,000 years. They survived wars and fires and floods and the complete collapse of the civilization that created them. They're still readable, still teaching us. Will our methods work as well? Will our digital archives survive a major infrastructure collapse? Will our seed vaults remain secure through centuries of climate change? Will our attempts at preservation actually preserve anything? Here's something that keeps me up at night. The Sumerians saw themselves as preservers. As people maintaining ancient knowledge, they believed they were remembering, not inventing, copying from older sources, restoring what was lost. What if they were right? What if there was an earlier civilization, one that left almost no trace, one that we haven't found yet because we're looking in the wrong places, or the evidence is buried too deep, or it was destroyed too completely? The flood myths are everywhere. The legends of golden ages, the stories of wise ancestors who knew secrets we've forgotten. Every culture has them. Maybe they're just myths, just humanity's tendency to imagine that the past was better. That wisdom lies behind us, not ahead. Or maybe they're memories, distorted by time, transformed by retelling, but containing a core of truth, that there was something before, something that knew things, something that was lost when the ice melted and the seas rose and the climate shifted at the end of the last glaciation. If that's true, then we're not the first information age. We're the second, or the third, or who knows what number in a long series of civilizations that rose and fell and left only whispers. And if that's true, then preservation matters even more. Because if knowledge can be lost that completely, if entire civilizations can vanish, leaving almost nothing, then what we save, how we save it, whether we save it at all, these aren't just academic questions. They're survival questions. The Sumerians tried. They wrote everything down. They made copies. They built libraries. They created a system designed to outlast them. And it worked. Partially. We recovered their language. We're reading their texts. We're learning from their successes and their failures. But imagine how much more we'd know if they'd written on stone instead of clay. If they'd carved their most important knowledge on indestructible monuments instead of fragile tablets. The Egyptians did that. That's why we know more about Egyptian history than Sumerian history. Not because Egypt was more important, but because hieroglyphics on stone last longer than cuneiform on clay. What's our stone? What medium will carry our most important knowledge through a dark age? Through whatever catastrophe might come? Maybe it's digital after all. If we maintain enough redundancy, enough copies in enough places, enough active preservation, or maybe we need something more fundamental, something that doesn't require infrastructure to read, something physical, durable, accessible. We're experimenting. The Long Now Foundation is carving a clock designed to run for 10,000 years, teaching patience, long-term thinking, the idea that we should plan beyond our lifetimes. Scientists are encoding data in DNA, in synthetic proteins, in materials that might last millions of years, turning information into geology, into chemistry, into biology. These are good ideas. Important experiments, but we're still guessing, still trying to imagine threats we can't predict, still hoping our preservation methods will work against challenges we don't understand. The Sumerians couldn't have imagined that their language would die, that their cities would be abandoned, that sand would bury everything they built, that 2,000 years would pass before anyone could read their writing again. But they prepared anyway. They wrote, they copied, they preserved. And because they did, they're not entirely lost. They speak to us still, through clay, through time, through the patient work of translators and archaeologists and now computers. We have the same responsibility. To the future, to whoever comes after us. Whether they're our direct descendants or distant successors after a collapse we don't survive. We need to preserve, not just data, knowledge, context, understanding, the hard-won insights about how to live, how to build, how to avoid the mistakes that killed previous civilizations. We need to be Sumerians, record keepers, fighting against forgetting, building archives that might survive us, hoping that someone, somewhere, somewhen, will find what we've left behind and learn from it. Because if civilizations are cycles, if everything rises and falls and rises again, then preservation is the only thing that creates progress. The only way the next cycle starts higher than the last one. The only way knowledge accumulates instead of resetting to zero with each collapse. The Sumerians gave us that gift. They preserved enough that we didn't have to reinvent everything. We could build on their foundation, learn from their achievements, avoid some of their mistakes. What will we give to whoever comes after us? What foundation will we leave? What knowledge will survive? Those are the questions that matter. Not just for understanding the past, but for creating a future. Chapter 8. The Unanswered Questions. After everything we've explored tonight, after all the evidence and theories and parallels, we're still left with mysteries. Questions that don't have answers. Gaps in our understanding that might never be filled. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries are supposed to remain mysteries. Not because we're not smart enough to solve them, but because the evidence is gone, lost to time, destroyed by the very catastrophes the Sumerians wrote about. But let's lay out the questions anyway. Let's look at what we still don't know, what still doesn't make sense, what keeps archaeologists arguing and historians guessing, and people like us awake at 3 a.m, wondering. First question, the biggest one, the one that underlies everything else. Where did the Sumerians come from? They appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4,500 years before the Common Era, maybe earlier. We don't know exactly because the archaeological record before that point is sparse. Confusing, open to interpretation, but whenever they arrived with culture already formed, language already developed, ideas already sophisticated. They weren't primitive nomads slowly figuring out agriculture. They were organized, knowledgeable, ready to build cities. So where were they before Mesopotamia? Where did they develop this culture? This language that doesn't relate to any other known language family. These ideas that appeared fully formed. Some scholars suggest they came from the east. From the area that's now Iran or even further into Central Asia. There are hints of contact, trade, goods, shared motifs in early pottery. But there's no clear migration trail. No series of earlier settlements showing gradual movement. They just show up in Sumer. Already themselves. Already Sumerian. Others suggest they were there all along. That they developed in place from earlier Mesopotamian cultures. That what looks like sudden appearance is really just a gap in the archaeological record. That the earlier phases exist but haven't been found yet. Maybe they're buried deeper. Under silt from 5,000 years of river flooding. Under the water table. In areas that are now too dangerous to excavate because of modern conflicts. That's possible. Plausible, even. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But it doesn't explain the language. Sumerian is an isolate. It doesn't fit into any language family. It's not related to the Semitic languages spoken by their neighbors. It's not related to Indo-European. Not related to anything we've found. Languages don't appear from nowhere. They evolve. Branch off from parent languages. Carry traces of their origins in their vocabulary and grammar. Unless the parent language died. unless all the related languages vanished, unless Sumerian is the last survivor of a language family that once spread across a region but was wiped out by some catastrophe. The flood, perhaps. The climate upheaval at the end of the Ice Age. If that's true, then Sumerian isn't just a language. It's an orphan. The sole remaining speaker of a conversation that died out everywhere else. And that implies something haunting. That there were other cultures, other peoples, speaking related languages, sharing similar ideas, but they're gone now, completely. No trace except this one survivor that made it to Mesopotamia and wrote everything down before the knowledge could vanish. Second question, how did they know what they knew? We've talked about their mathematics, their astronomy, their engineering, all of it sophisticated, all of it appearing without clear precursors. The standard explanation is that they developed it over time, through observation, through trial and error, through the accumulation of knowledge across generations, and that works for most things. You can figure out irrigation through experimentation. You can develop mathematics by needing to count and measure and divide. You can learn astronomy by watching the sky every night for decades. But some of what they knew seems too precise, too accurate, too advanced for the tools they had. The Venus tablets, for instance, tracking that planet's movements with accuracy that matches modern calculations. How? Venus is complicated. Its orbit is elliptical. Its apparent motion changes based on Earth's position. Mapping it requires not just observation but understanding. A model. Mathematics sophisticated enough to predict where it will be based on where it's been. Did they figure all that out through pure observation? Watching the sky for centuries, recording everything, building up enough data to see the patterns? Maybe. Probably. That's the most rational explanation. But it requires an obsession with astronomy that seems excessive. Who watches Venus that carefully for that long unless they already know it's important? Unless someone told them to watch. Unless they're confirming something they already believe, rather than discovering it for the first time. And the precession question, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete. Some researchers believe Sumerian texts reference this, encode knowledge of it in their numbers, in their mythology. But you can't observe precession in a lifetime, or even in a civilization's lifetime. The shift is too gradual. It takes thousands of years to become noticeable. You'd need continuous astronomical observation across that entire period, records maintained with perfect accuracy, calculations precise enough to detect the tiny annual change. Did the Sumerians have that? Or did they inherit the knowledge from someone who did? Someone who watched the sky for not centuries but millennia. Someone whose observations began before the flood and continued after. We don't know. Can't know. The evidence that would answer the question is missing. Either it never existed, or it's lost. Buried. Destroyed. Waiting to be found. Third question. What happened in the gap? Between the end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, and the appearance of Sumerian civilization around 5,500 years ago, there's a period of 6,000 years, 6 millennia, where humans were definitely alive, definitely active, leaving traces, but no cities, no writing, no complex civilizations that we've found, just scattered settlements, hunter-gatherer camps, early farming villages, simple, small scale, nothing approaching the sophistication of Sumer. And then suddenly, Sumer, with cities and writing and mathematics and astronomy, a leap forward that seems too big, too fast. What happened in those 6,000 years? Was it really slow, gradual development that just hasn't left much archaeological trace? Or was there something else? Something that got erased? The rising sea levels after the Ice Age flooded vast areas of coastal land, places where humans had lived for thousands of years. The Persian Gulf, for instance, was dry land during the Ice Age. A river valley, potentially inhabited. Now it's underwater, hundreds of feet underwater. If there were settlements there, cities, even, advanced cultures developing along that ancient river, they're gone now, drowned, buried under sediment, impossible to excavate with current technology. The same is true for coastlines worldwide. Millions of square miles of land that humans occupied during the Ice Age are now beneath the ocean. We haven't explored most of it, haven't looked for ruins, haven't checked whether something more than primitive camps might be down there. Maybe the gap isn't a gap. Maybe it's a hidden chapter. Evidence that exists but we haven't found. Can't access. Don't know how to look for. Or maybe the gap is real. Maybe human development really was slow for thousands of years. Gradual. Unremarkable. Until something clicked. Some innovation or insight or lucky combination of factors. And then, progress accelerated. Civilization emerged. Both explanations are possible. Both fit the evidence we have. But they lead to very different understandings of history, of who we are, of whether Sumer was the beginning or just the part that survived. Fourth question. Why did they stop? Not why did Sumer collapse? We covered that. Environmental degradation, political fragmentation, conquest, river migration. The usual causes of civilizational decline. But why did the knowledge stop? Why didn't later civilizations build on what Sumer achieved? Why did some things have to be rediscovered, reinvented? The mathematics survived. The astronomy survived. The writing system evolved but continued. But other things were lost. Medical knowledge, engineering techniques, legal principles that took centuries to redevelop. Why? Knowledge should accumulate, each generation building on the last. Information preserved in writing, available to anyone who can read. But that's not what happened. There were dark ages, periods where literacy declined, where libraries burned, where the people who understood the old knowledge died without passing it on, and the knowledge died with them, even though it was written down, even though the tablets still existed, because knowing the tablets exist isn't the same as knowing how to read them. Knowing how to read them isn't the same as understanding what they mean. Context gets lost. Terminology becomes obscure. Ideas that seemed obvious to the people who wrote them become incomprehensible to later readers. The tablets survive, but the understanding doesn't. This has happened repeatedly in human history. Ancient knowledge lost, rediscovered centuries later. New innovations that are actually just recoveries of old techniques. Greek fire, Roman concrete, Damascus steel, medieval technologies that we still don't fully understand. That died with the craftsmen who made them. That left behind examples but not recipes, objects but not knowledge. If we, with all our technology, can lose knowledge this easily, how much did earlier civilizations lose? How many Sumerian insights disappeared not because the tablets were destroyed but because nobody remembered what they meant? And if that's true, then what we know about Sumer is just a fraction. The tip of an iceberg, the part that remained comprehensible across the millennia, while the deeper knowledge, the sophisticated understanding, the subtle insights, those sank into obscurity. Maybe the Sumerians knew far more than we give them credit for. Maybe their civilization was even more advanced than the evidence suggests. But the evidence that would prove it is sitting in museum basements, untranslated, or buried under sand, waiting, or lost entirely, gone beyond recovery. Fifth question. Are we them? Not literally, not genetically, though modern people in Iraq likely carry some Sumerian DNA, but culturally, psychologically, spiritually, are we making the same mistakes, building the same kind of civilization, heading toward the same kind of collapse? We've noted the parallels. Information systems that create as many problems as they solve, infrastructure that we can't imagine abandoning even as it damages us, political divisions that prevent collective action, environmental degradation that we see happening but can't stop, complexity that makes us vulnerable to cascading failures. The Sumerians had all of this, and they collapsed. Not because they were stupid or ignorant or primitive, but because complex systems are inherently unstable, because civilizations create the conditions for their own destruction, because the things that make you successful in the short term often kill you in the long term. If we're following the same pattern, does that mean we're doomed to the same fate? Is civilizational collapse inevitable? Are we just living through the prosperous phase before the fall? Or can we learn from Sumer? Can we see what they couldn't? Can we make different choices? Change course before it's too late. These aren't just historical questions, they're questions about our future, about whether studying the past can actually help us avoid repeating it, about whether knowing how civilizations die gives us any power to prevent it. The answer isn't clear. History suggests that civilizations rarely learn from other civilizations' mistakes, that each one thinks it's different, special, that the old rules don't apply. But maybe we're different. Maybe having a 5,000-year view, maybe understanding the patterns, maybe having the technology to see what's happening in real time instead of reconstructing it from ruins. Maybe that gives us a chance. Or maybe not. Maybe the forces that destroyed Sumer are too fundamental, too built into the nature of complex civilizations, too powerful for knowledge or wisdom or foresight to overcome. We won't know until we know. Until our civilization either survives or doesn't, either adapts or collapses, either learns from Sumer or repeats it. The unanswered questions remain unanswered. Maybe they always will. Maybe the evidence is too fragmentary, the gaps too large, the time too vast. But the questions themselves are valuable. They remind us how little we actually know, how much of history is mystery, how many assumptions we make, how tentative our understanding really is. The Sumerians came from somewhere. They knew things. They built a civilization. They collapsed. They left traces. That much we know. Everything else is interpretation, guesswork, the best explanations we can construct from incomplete evidence. And those explanations keep changing. Each new discovery forces revisions. Each translated tablet adds context. Each archaeological find challenges assumptions. The story of Sumer isn't settled. It's ongoing, still being written, still being discovered, still being argued over in academic journals and late-night conversations. And that's how it should be. Because certainty is the enemy of truth. As soon as we think we know everything, we stop looking, stop questioning, stop being open to evidence that contradicts our comfortable narratives. The Sumerians left us more than just their innovations. They left us their mysteries. And mysteries are gifts, invitations to wonder, to question, to imagine possibilities beyond our current understanding. So the questions remain. Where did they come from? How did they know? What happened in the gap? Why did the knowledge stop? Are we them? Maybe someday we'll have answers. Or maybe the questions are the point. Maybe the search is more valuable than the finding. Maybe uncertainty keeps us humble, keeps us curious, keeps us looking at the stars and wondering if someone else, somewhere, somewhen, is looking back. We began tonight with a question. What if the oldest story we've ever told wasn't the beginning at all? What if it was only the last echo of something far older? And now, hours into this journey through time and clay and forgotten cities, maybe you have your own answer. Or maybe, like me, you have more questions than when we started. That's okay. That's good, actually. Because the story of Sumer isn't meant to provide easy answers. It's meant to complicate everything you thought you knew about human history, about where we came from, about how long we've been thinking, building, wondering. 5,000 years ago, scribes pressed reeds into wet clay. They recorded grain shipments and temple offerings. They copied ancient king lists and star charts. They wrote down myths about gods descending from heaven and floods that drowned the world. They did this knowing the tablets would outlast them, hoping that someone, somewhere, in the unimaginable future, would find these marks and understand, would hear their voices across the void of centuries. And here we are, listening, understanding, connected to those scribes by the simple miracle of writing, by their decision to preserve, to document, to fight against forgetting. The Sumerians are gone. Their language is dead. Their cities are ruins buried under sand. But they're not silent. Every 60-second minute that passes, every 360-degree circle you draw, every written word you read, they're there, whispering, reminding us that they built the foundation we're still standing on. Think about what they achieved. Really think about it. They invented writing. Not the alphabet we use, but the concept. The radical idea that thoughts could be frozen in time, that words could exist independent of the speaker. That knowledge could accumulate beyond memory's limits. They created mathematics that we still use. Base 60. A number system so elegant, so perfectly suited for dividing time and space, that 5,000 years of innovation hasn't found anything better. They mapped the heavens with precision that shouldn't have been possible, tracked planets, predicted eclipses, understood cycles that take human lifetimes to complete. They built cities that housed tens of thousands, engineered irrigation systems that turned deserts into gardens, created legal codes that protected the vulnerable and regulated commerce. They wrote stories that still move us. Gilgamesh searching for immortality, Inanna descending to the underworld. Myths that became the templates for every story we've told since. And they did all of this without computers, without telescopes, without any of the tools we consider essential for civilization. Just human minds, human hands, and clay. If they could achieve that much with so little, what does it say about human potential? About what we're capable of when we commit to something, when we decide that knowledge matters, that the future deserves our best effort. But they also teach us about fragility, about how quickly everything can fall apart. 2,000 years of civilization, brilliant, sophisticated, advanced, and then it collapsed. The cities emptied, the language died, the knowledge faded, not because of a single catastrophe, not because of one mistake, but because of accumulated stresses, small failures that compounded, systems that broke down gradually until they couldn't recover. We like to think we're different, that our civilization is more resilient, that we've learned from history, that technology makes us invulnerable. But the Sumerians probably thought the same thing. They had the best irrigation in the world, the most advanced agriculture, the most sophisticated government. They were the pinnacle of human achievement. And it wasn't enough. The soil still poisoned. The climate still shifted. The rivers still changed course. The enemies still invaded. Brilliance doesn't protect you from reality. Knowledge doesn't make you immortal. Civilization is always, always more fragile than it appears. The question is whether we can see that, whether we can accept our own vulnerability, whether we can make the hard choices necessary to preserve what we've built, or whether we'll repeat their pattern. Prosperity, complacency, denial, decline, collapse. I think about those fingerprints sometimes, the ones pressed into clay 6,000 years ago, still visible, still unique, still carrying the identity of a person whose name we'll never know. That person lived a life, had thoughts, felt emotions, loved people, feared death, wondered about the stars. Just like we do. The details of their life are lost. We don't know if they were happy, whether they had children, what dreams kept them awake at night, but their fingerprint remains, proof that they existed, that they were here, that they mattered. In a way, that's what all of human civilization is. A collective fingerprint pressed into time. An attempt to prove we were here, to leave something that outlasts us, to matter beyond our brief moment of existence. The Sumerians succeeded. 5,000 years later, we're still talking about them, still learning from them, still marveling at what they achieved. What fingerprint will we leave? What will people 5,000 years from now say about us? Will they wonder at our achievements? Will they puzzle over our mysteries? Will they learn from our mistakes? Or will we be forgotten? Lost like the civilizations before Sumer that may or may not have existed. Like the knowledge that died when languages went extinct. Like the cities that drowned when the ice melted. Here's what I believe. What I've come to understand through this deep dive into Sumerian history. Civilization is not a steady march of progress. It's a cycle. Rise and fall. Creation and destruction. Memory and forgetting. We rise. We achieve. We build. We create knowledge and beauty and systems of staggering complexity. And then we fall. Through hubris or neglect or forces beyond our control. The knowledge scatters. The buildings crumble. The connections break. Our own fingerprints pressed into whatever medium outlasts us. And maybe, hopefully, each cycle starts a little higher than the last, builds on a slightly better foundation, avoids a few more mistakes, preserves a little more knowledge, That's what progress really is. Not a line going up forever, but a spiral. Circling back to familiar problems, but at a higher level of understanding. Repeating patterns, but with more wisdom. Falling, but not as far. Rising, but starting from a better place. The Sumerians gave us that gift. They lifted the baseline, set a standard, showed what's possible. Now it's our turn. To build, to preserve, to add our chapter to the story, to leave fingerprints that might last another 5,000 years. So what do you believe? About where the Sumerians came from? About how they knew what they knew? About whether they were remembering or inventing? I'm not going to tell you what to think. This isn't that kind of story. There's no definitive answer. No proof that settles everything. There's evidence. Lots of it. Clay tablets and ruined cities and astronomical charts. There's mainstream interpretation. Academic consensus about how to understand that evidence. But there's also mystery. Gaps in the record. Questions without answers. Possibilities that the mainstream doesn't acknowledge but can't entirely dismiss. Maybe the Sumerians were exactly what they appear to be. The first civilization. The inventors of everything we associate with civilized life. Brilliant pioneers working from scratch. Maybe they were survivors. Heirs to an earlier culture lost in the Ice Age catastrophe. Preservers of ancient knowledge. Rebuilders rather than inventors. Maybe they had help. From visitors or travelers or beings we don't have categories for. Teachers who came from elsewhere and shared knowledge. The Anunnaki as something more than myth. All of these explanations fit some of the evidence. None of them fit all of it. The truth might be a combination, or something we haven't imagined yet, or something too strange for us to accept even if we found proof. The point is to stay curious, to keep questioning, to hold your beliefs lightly enough that new evidence can change them. Because the story isn't over. We're still finding tablets, still excavating cities, still translating texts, still discovering that what we thought we knew was incomplete. The Sumerians are still teaching us, still surprising us, still refusing to fit neatly into our categories and timelines and explanations. And that's exactly as it should be. It's late now, or early, depending on your perspective. The night has deepened. The world has quieted. Somewhere, right now, an archaeologist is cataloguing clay fragments in a museum basement. A computer is translating cuneiform. A satellite is mapping buried cities beneath the sand. The work continues. The story unfolds. The mysteries persist. And you're part of it now. Because you listened. Because you wondered. Because you were willing to sit with uncertainty and complexity and questions that don't have easy answers. The Sumerians would appreciate that. They were record keepers, storytellers, question askers. They looked at the world and wanted to understand, wanted to preserve, wanted to connect past and future. We're doing the same thing, in different ways, with different tools, but the same basic impulse, the same desire to know, to remember, to leave something behind. Before you go, do me a favor. Look up at the stars if you can. If it's clear where you are, if light pollution hasn't stolen them completely, find Venus if it's visible, or Jupiter, or just pick any bright point of light. And remember that a Sumerian priest astronomer might have looked at that same star 5,000 years ago, tracked it, recorded it, wondered about it, wondered if anyone in the future would look at the same star and think of them. Well, here you are, thinking of them. Connected across 5 millennia by light and curiosity and the shared human need to understand. That connection is real. That's not metaphor or poetry. That's the actual miracle of human consciousness. Our ability to reach across time, to speak to the future, to hear the past. The Sumerians are still here, in the 60 seconds ticking away, in the circles we draw, in the words we write, in the questions we ask, and we'll still be here. Long after we're gone. In whatever forms our knowledge takes, in whatever survives of what we build and create and preserve, memory doesn't die. It just transforms, waits, resurfaces when someone is ready to listen. So, thank you for listening tonight, for taking this journey, for sitting with the mystery and wonder of Sumer. If you enjoyed this exploration, Subscribe for more deep dives into history's strangest corners. Drop a comment about which theory resonates with you. Or tell me what other ancient mysteries you'd like to explore. And remember, the story isn't finished. New discoveries are happening all the time. The next translated tablet might answer questions we've been asking for centuries, or create new mysteries we never imagined. Stay curious. Stay questioning. Stay connected to the long story of humanity trying to understand itself. The Sumerians started that story, but we're still writing it, still living it, still pressing our own fingerprints into time. Sleep well, and may your dreams take you back to the beginning, or forward to whatever comes next, or sideways into the mysteries that connect them both. The clay tablets are still whispering. If you know how to listen, good night.